All right, let's dive into the philosophy of Nishida Kitaro. He's a 20th century Japanese philosopher. He tackled some of the biggest questions in philosophy. And in a way that's super fascinating, and I think it's incredibly relevant, especially to anyone working in philosophy today.
Oh, absolutely.
So our source for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
Yeah.
the entry on Nishida. I think you'll be surprised, even if you haven't really encountered Eastern philosophy that much before, how much his ideas resonate with contemporary thought.
Yeah, he really is a bridge figure in a lot of ways.
We're going to kind of untangle some of his key concepts,
Right.
like, things like pure experience,
Yeah.
the logic of place, even absolute nothingness. We'll see how they connect to debates that are, well, still very much alive in philosophy today.
Yeah, he's surprisingly contemporary in a lot of ways.
By the end, I think you'll have a new appreciation for his unique contribution, and maybe even some fresh perspectives to bring to your own philosophical work.
For sure.
So let's start with the man himself.
Okay.
Nishida was born in a really interesting time. Japan was modernizing, like rapidly, grappling with Western thought, and he was right in the thick of it. He studied intensely, practiced Zen meditation, and eventually rose to become one of Japan's, really most influential thinkers. I always find it fascinating how a philosopher's personal journey shapes their ideas. I bet you've noticed that in your own work, too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The biographical details always, they illuminate the text in a way that you just can't get otherwise.
Right, like where are they coming from? What are their influences?
Exactly.
So what's remarkable about Nishida is he didn't just, import Western philosophy to Japan.
Right.
He really engaged with it deeply and critically, and ultimately, I think, transformed it.
Yeah, I think that's right. He really took what was valuable from Western thought and made it his own.
He did this in a few crucial ways. He helped establish philosophy as a legitimate field, a creative field even in Japan, showing that it wasn't just a Western import.
Yeah. And that's a huge contribution in itself, right?
Yeah.
To show that philosophy can be done from any cultural perspective.
Right.
Not just a Western thing.
It's not just like, okay, this is what they're doing over there, we're going to copy it. It's like, no, we can actually engage with this and produce something new.
Exactly.
So he brought, Asian philosophical insights to bear on Western thought, which I think, enriched it in the process.
For sure. He was really a pioneer in comparative philosophy, showing how these different traditions could speak to each other.
And most significantly for us, he developed completely new theories of the self and the world. That have implications for everything from contemporary metaphysics to ethics and even philosophy of science.
Yeah, and those are some big areas. He didn't shy away from the big questions.
No, he did not.
That's for sure.
All right, let's dive into one of his core early concepts.
Okay.
Pure experience.
Right.
Now, I know this might sound a bit abstract.
Yeah, I can see that.
At first glance. But the Stanford Encyclopedia uses a really helpful example. It's experiencing a running horse.
Oh, okay.
To illustrate. Can you break this down for us?
Sure. So imagine you're just, seeing a horse running. But before you even categorize it as a horse,
Okay.
before you recognize that, you are separate from it.
Right.
There's this raw immediacy there, a kind of undifferentiated reality that precedes the subject-object split.
Gotcha.
That's what Nishida calls pure experience.
Okay.
It's not about individual perception, really. It's more like the fundamental ground from which all things arise.
I see.
It's really the starting point for his whole system.
And it's important to note here that, Nishida's not an idealist.
Right.
Right. He's not saying that the mind, creates reality out of nothing.
No, not at all. He's very clear about that.
Okay, good.
Pure experience is reality itself.
Right.
Before any kind of mental construction or interpretation.
Okay.
It's pre-conceptual, pre-linguistic even. The very ground of being, you might say.
Okay, so if that's the starting point,
Yeah.
how do we get from this, this pure experience to reflective thought?
Yeah.
To the kind of philosophy that we engage in?
Right.
Later on, he uses this image of seeing without a seer, which sounds, almost paradoxical.
Right.
What's he getting at there?
That's where his concept of self-awareness comes into play. Now, he's not talking about individual self-consciousness here.
Okay.
He's talking about the very structure of consciousness itself.
Right.
Imagine an infinite set that contains and reflects itself within its subsets.
Whoa.
That's how he conceives of self-awareness.
Okay.
It's not a little me inside
Right.
observing the world. It's
Right.
more like the world itself is self-aware.
Okay.
And we're just, part of that.
Wow.
It's a really radical rethinking of the subject-object relationship.
So it's not that I'm like observing the world from some isolated vantage point.
Right.
It's that the world is observing itself through me
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
and through every other being.
Exactly.
That has some pretty profound implications for how we think about perception and knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. And it leads Nishida to critique, traditional subject-predicate logic, which he sees as, inadequate for capturing this dynamic, interconnected reality. Instead, he proposes what he calls the logic of place.
Okay, and this is where things start to get really interesting, at least from from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through this logic of place?
Sure.
What does it mean for something to have a place in Nishida's system?
So think about the color red. It doesn't exist like as an independent thing, right?
Right.
Its redness is placed within the larger field, or what he calls topos of color.
Okay.
Everything for Nishida exists within a particular topos.
Right.
A field, a context, a place.
I love that. I love his use of the word tupoi.
Yeah.
It evokes this image of like nested spaces, almost like, those Russian dolls that fit inside one another.
Exactly. He envisions this whole hierarchy of these topoi, so, individual judgments. They're within the topos of consciousness,
Okay.
which itself is within the topos of self-awareness and so on.
Okay.
All the way up to the most inclusive topos.
Which is...
include nothingness.
Hold on a second. Absolute nothingness.
Yeah.
That sounds, like a contradiction in terms. How can nothingness be the ground of everything? I'm sure our listener is wondering about this too.
That's where it gets really mind-bending.
Yeah.
And where Nishida's philosophy takes a truly radical turn. It's a puzzle that has challenged philosophers, really, for centuries.
Yeah.
How can something come from nothing?
Right.
Nishida's answer is, well, it's radical and incredibly insightful.
Okay.
He argues that absolute nothingness, it isn't a void or an absence. It's not the opposite of being. It's rather the dynamic, creative ground from which all things emerge.
So it's not a static emptiness.
Right.
It's like a dynamic potentiality,
Yes,
a source of creativity.
Exactly. It's like the fertile ground from which a seed sprouts, or the white canvas upon which an artist paints. It's not a thing itself, but the condition for the possibility of all things.
Okay.
It's the ultimate source of both being and becoming.
That's a powerful image. But I'm curious, how does this concept of absolute nothingness connect to Nishida's other ideas? Like, pure experience and the logic of place.
Well, it connects beautifully. Remember, pure experience is that undifferentiated reality before the subject-object split. Well, absolute nothingness is the ground of that pure experience.
Okay.
It's the source from which the world of distinctions arises.
Right.
And the logic of place helps us to understand how those distinctions are organized and interconnected. Everything has its place within a larger topos, ultimately leading back to absolute nothingness.
Okay, I see. So it's like the absolute nothingness is the wellspring, and everything else flows from it, taking shape and finding its place within this interconnected web of reality.
Precisely. And this interconnectedness isn't just a metaphysical idea for Nishida.
Right.
It has profound implications for how we understand ourselves, our relationship to the world, and even the nature of knowledge.
That's what I find so fascinating about Nishida. He takes these abstract metaphysical concepts and shows how they connect to concrete human experience. Speaking of which, he wasn't just a metaphysician, was he?
No.
He also grappled with the historical world and the role of the individual within it.
Absolutely. And this is where his philosophy becomes, I think, particularly relevant for us.
Right.
As philosophers living in a complex, ever-changing world. For Nishida, the historical world, it isn't just a sequence of events.
Right.
It's a living, dynamic process of becoming. It's the realm where individuals and the world constantly shape and create each other.
So it's not a static backdrop.
No.
It's an active source, constantly evolving and influencing our lives. It sounds almost like he's anticipating some of the ideas that we see in contemporary continental philosophy.
Yeah.
Like the emphasis on historicity, the co-constitution of self and world.
You're right to see those connections. Nishida was definitely ahead of his time in many ways.
Yeah.
He saw history not as this linear progression, but as a complex interplay of forces. where individuals and communities are both shaped by and actively shaping the world around them.
I remember reading that he used the example of artistic creation to illustrate this point.
Yes. He argued that an artist, they aren't just expressing some pre-existing idea.
Right.
They're actively engaged in a process of world-making.
Okay.
Through their art, they're both responding to and transforming the world around them.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful example of how the individual and the world are co-creating each other through action and expression.
It makes me think of his concept of inactive intuition, that fusion of seeing and acting, understanding and creating. It's a cool term. How does this inactive intuition fit into his understanding of the historical world?
It's essential. For Nishida, an active intuition isn't just a mental process.
Right.
It's a bodily lived experience of being in and engaging with the world. It's the way we come to know and shape reality through action, perception, and creative expression. And this process of inactive intuition is constantly unfolding within the historical world, where individuals and communities are continually encountering new challenges and creating new possibilities.
So it's through this active engagement with the world, through our actions, our perceptions, and our creations, that we contribute to this ongoing process of history making.
Precisely. And this brings us to one of Nishida's most profound and challenging insights.
Okay.
The idea that I am myself by knowing my own death. He's not talking about literal death here.
Right.
He's talking about the recognition of our own finitude, our limits, our impermanence.
That's a powerful statement. It reminds me of some of the existentialist thinkers who emphasize the importance of confronting our own mortality. How does this knowing one's own death contribute to our understanding of self and world in Nishida's system?
For Nishida, it's through the recognition of our own limits that we truly come to understand ourselves and our place in the world. It's by acknowledging our finitude that we can fully appreciate the infinite potentiality of absolute nothingness, the source from which we emerge and to which we ultimately return.
It sounds almost paradoxical. By confronting our own limitations, we open ourselves up to the infinite.
Exactly. It's a paradox that lies at the heart of Nishida's philosophy. The idea that by negating ourselves, by recognizing our own impermanence, we actually come to a deepened understanding of the absolute, the ground of all being.
It's a profound and challenging idea. Definitely something for our listener to ponder. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore. How does God fit into all of this? Nishida was deeply influenced by Buddhist thought, but he also engaged with, Western religious ideas.
Yeah.
What's his take on the relationship between the finite self and the absolute, the divine?
That's a great question, and one that leads us to the heart of Nishida's philosophy of religion. It really is a fascinating question. I mean, how does this, very personal, very finite self relate to something as vast and encompassing as the absolute? It's a question that has preoccupied philosophers and theologians for millennia, right?
Right.
And Nishida, drawing on both Eastern and Western thought, offers a perspective that I think is both challenging and deeply insightful.
Well, let's hear it. How does he conceive of God or the absolute? I mean, does he see it as a separate being outside of the world or something else entirely?
For Nishida, God isn't a transcendent being, like sitting up there judging us, It's not about a personal God in the traditional sense.
Okay, so not the God we might find in, say, like classical Western theism.
Exactly. Instead, he sees the absolute as immanent.
Okay, immanent meaning...
It's within the world. It's not separate from it.
So it's woven into the very fabric of reality.
Yeah, exactly. It embraces all things, even in their, what he calls, diabolical forms.
Diabolical forms. That's an interesting choice of words. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think he's acknowledging that reality includes suffering, it includes darkness, it includes, things that we might find difficult or even repulsive. But for Nishida, even those aspects are part of the absolute. They're not excluded.
So it's more inclusive vision of the divine. It doesn't shy away from the difficult parts of reality.
Exactly. It's a vision of an absolute that embraces the totality of existence.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly. It's all part of the picture.
That's pretty radical. And how does the individual self fit into this picture? What's the relationship between this finite self and this all-encompassing absolute?
That's where his concept of inverse correlation comes in.
Inverse correlation. Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean?
Basically, he's saying that the closer we come to the absolute, the more aware we become of our own finitude.
So it's not about, like, merging with the absolute or losing our individuality.
No, not at all. It's about recognizing that our individuality, our finitude, is part of what makes the relationship with the absolute possible.
It's like the two define each other. You can't have one without the other.
Right. The more we understand the vastness of the absolute, the more we realize the preciousness, the uniqueness of our own individual existence. It's a paradox, but it's a profound one.
I'm sensing a theme here. Paradox seems to be a key part of how Nishida approaches these big questions.
Absolutely. He embraces paradox as a way of pointing to truths that can't be captured by logic alone.
Well, this has been a truly mind-bending journey into the philosophy of Nishida Kitaro. We've covered a lot of ground, from pure experience to the logic of place, from the historical world to the relationship between the finite self and the absolute. And throughout it all, we've seen Nishida challenging our assumptions, pushing us to think in new ways, and ultimately inviting us to see the world with fresh eyes.
He really is a philosopher for our time, I think. His insights into the nature of self, the interconnectedness of all things, the importance of dialogue across cultures, they're more relevant than ever.
I think our listeners will walk away from this deep dive with a lot to chew on, and hopefully a newfound appreciation for this remarkable Japanese philosopher.
I hope so too. He's a thinker who deserves to be read and discussed and engaged with.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of a philosophical mind.
Until then, stay curious.